Hello everyone, this is John Byrne with Poets and Quants. Welcome to our webinar on a vision of leadership for a digitally driven world. We have a special guest live from New Zealand. You thought we were going to be from Irvine, California, didn't you? But no, it is the pandemic still. But we do have the new dean of UC Irvine's Merage School of Business, Ian Williamson. Ian, welcome. Great to see you.
John, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I want to give a little background on Ian because he has a fascinating background. He was born in Chicago. That's why you're hearing an American accent. He joined the Merage School as dean. I guess technically you started on Jan 1.
January 1st, I started.
There you go. Started virtually, I suppose, because you still are in New Zealand. In New Zealand, he had left the post of Pro Vice Chancellor and Dean of the Wellington School of Business and Government, which is sort of an unusual combination that you often don't see in the United States. The university is Victoria University in New Zealand. Now, but Ian is taught, after getting his PhD at Chapel Hill at UNC, he's taught at Maryland. Then he went off to teach at the Melbourne Business School in Australia. He has done a stint in Indonesia as a visiting professor. He has an ongoing affiliation with Rutgers Business School in New Jersey as a scholar. And of course, he ended up, until more recently, at Victoria University in New Zealand. Why all the wanderlust?
Well, I don't know if I could say that it was, I guess as an HR professor, I shouldn't say this publicly, but I don't think I necessarily had a plan per se for the career. As much as I got into this profession, one of the things that one of my first mentors told me, they said, one of the beauties of being in the academy is that if you want to, you can learn something new every day. And he says, you have to make a choice, however, whether or not you want to actually take advantage of that benefit. And that was one of the huge selling points for me. And so as I've gone through my career, the opportunity to learn something new, to work with different communities, to test myself, to see how I could provide value in different settings, that was always sort of the passion. And it just so happened that began to materialize itself in opportunities in a wide variety of settings that happen to be in different countries and different parts of the world. So it's been really a blessing. It's been fantastic to be able to contribute in that way.
Now, Ian, I know your mom was a school teacher and your dad
Yes.
worked for AT&T, first as an engineer and then later in the finance arm, I guess. What was it about academics that kind of enthralled you, that hooked you, that made you decide to become one?
Well, I certainly can't say if I went back to look at my high school career that my parents would have looked at my performance in high school and said, "This is a kid who's going to be an academic." So I shouldn't I shouldn't give the impression that I was some type of protege. But I
share
would
that in
certainly,
common then.
yeah. I must say my pathway is definitely shaped, and I give tremendous credit to the opportunity I had to go to university. And being able to do that was an eye-opening experience. I got my undergraduate degree from Miami University of Ohio in business. While I was there, I had some extraordinarily generous mentors who took me aside and actually talked to me about what it meant to be an academic. I'd never heard of that as a career. I didn't even know that that was a career pathway. I didn't even know that was a full-time job, to be quite frank, to show you how naive I was. But they sort of opened my eyes to things around what research was. And I'll say on the other side, I became extraordinarily enamored with universities and just seeing the impact it was having on my life and the impact that it can have on community. And I just became really enamored. I remember very vividly, like at the age of 19, thinking, I don't know where I want to work, but if I could work at an institution like this that does these types of things, I'll be really, really satisfied. And so that seed was planted years and years ago. And later then, after some time in corporate, I went back to get my PhD. I was really fortunate to be involved in an organization called the PhD Project, which was designed to encourage students to pursue PhDs in business. And then it sort of started, but that desire to sort of be in an institution that kind of has that type of impact has really been quite amazing.
Now, I know that you have done a lot of obviously scholarly work, including a study on virtual teams, which you recently consulted when you found yourself in many virtual meetings. What have you learned throughout that journey, the academic journey? I mean, you've taken a number of administrative roles as well, so you've actually had your leadership chops tested. But what have you learned in general that you bring to the Merage School of Business?
Well, over the last 20 some years, my research is primarily focused on one question, really. And it's how can organizations and communities create effective talent pipelines? And by that, I mean, at an organizational level, how can you attract, develop, utilize, retain talented people? And then over time, what that's been is looking more broadly about that at a community level, because I began to notice that struggling companies struggle with that ability to develop a talent pipeline, but actually struggling communities actually have the same problem. You know, struggling communities don't attract talent. They have a hard time developing or educating people. They tend to underutilize people. We think about that as unemployment, for example, or underemployment. And then they have a challenge retaining people. And you can look at communities where repatriation is a huge concern. And so it's been very rewarding for me to take my academic work, but be able to apply that in settings where you can actually address meaningful organizational or community challenges. And that's ranged from working with the Reserve Bank in New Zealand as they were going through major disruptions over the last year and a half, as they thought about their role within COVID, working with indigenous entrepreneurs in Australia and New Zealand, working with entrepreneurs in Indonesia, or even classical musical event organizations in Switzerland. You know, the common theme across all of them is how do we think about the development of an effective talent pipeline? And so I've seen the ability to sort of do that at a personal level, being able to connect the academic with the, if you like, the practical. But then I've also had roles in my administrative positions where I've allowed myself to work with the organization to do that at an organizational level and really see how universities, and particularly business schools, can drive both economic and social impact in communities.
Yeah. And you clearly have learned how important people are.
Yeah.
Your mentors at Miami obviously were crucial in setting you on this path. And people make everything happen or not.
They do. You know, just, you know, the individual decisions that people made to sort of invest some time in me, you know, has generated a lot of phenomenal outcomes for me personally. But then at the end of the day, we're a knowledge organization as a university. You know, what we provide, our service, is ultimately the ingenuity and the passion of individuals. And so as a leader or as an administrator in those type of situations, it really is how do we harness that and make it more accessible to individuals.
So now you come to California, or will,
Mm.
in an incredibly vibrant area of the country and the world, for that matter. A lot of startup activity in and around
Yeah.
Orange County, and to a school that plays a vital role in that community and beyond. What was it that attracted you in the first place to the job and to Mirage?
Well, I think, you know, you start opportunities, time and place in many respects. And so one of the things that attracted me was both the time and the place. So Orange County is, just as you described it, a very dynamic environment. The diversity of the county, the diversity of the region stood out to me. You know, 30% of the population is foreign born. I was reading a statistic, 46% of the people in the county actually speak another language other than English at home.
Whoa.
And you know, just the types of cultures and experiences that come from all around the world is really quite amazing. And I think personally, you know, having had the experience of living in a lot of different places professionally, that resonated with me because I see diversity truly as an important ingredient for innovation.
Mhm.
And you know, you see it also being manifested, right? So it's exciting to be joining Silicon Beach, as they called it, you know, and the very amazing businesses we have there in life sciences and computer products and pharmaceuticals and aerospace. And you know, I've always had a passion around innovation and working with organizations around that. So I just thought to some extent it'd be a really nice sandbox for a business school to be able to play in. And also, you know, UCI and the Merage School had a desire to do that. right? And so I think the university has tried to position itself as a nexus around technology and health and business. And that's been fantastic. But I should say probably one of the big things that really sold me on the institution was a very overt commitment to diversity and inclusion.
Yeah.
And a very explicit mission by the chancellor around that. A lot of pride in the fact that UCI is a Hispanic serving institution. And I think a very, if you like, proactive desire to have a voice in this particular space at a time where, as we know globally, but certainly in the United States, our society really does need universities to step up and provide a new narrative around what does it mean to actually have a multicultural society, and how do we actually create an assumption of inclusion in our communities. So, they wanted that as part of their mission, and that's certainly been a part of my career and something I have a lot of passion for. So I thought it was a good fit. And I should say too, the weather didn't hurt. That was actually that was a good draw as well.
Yeah, I've been in Chicago during the winter months, and I'm gonna tell you, not a place for me.
Yeah, Chicago will always be home, but only between May and September.
And it's kind of interesting in a way that the great challenges of our society today that have been revealed in terms of how little progress we've actually made on diversity and inclusion. The positive side of that is now we're focused and we're paying attention, and hopefully we can leverage this challenge in a way to make real and true progress. How optimistic are you about this opportunity right now? Because for many people, it's so easy to be pessimistic.
Well, I think I would start by saying the dynamics we've seen in the US over the last, say, 12 months, I think is really important to understand that it's a global dynamic. So one of the most interesting experiences that I've had was being at a Black Lives Matter rally in Wellington, New Zealand, in front of the Capitol with 10,000 people. Right. And sort of sitting there and experiencing that, thinking about the context of what this was about, and being one of the few African Americans in that audience, maybe 5 or 6 out of 10,000 people. Right. But being able to appreciate how this issue around inclusion, assumptions of equality, assumptions of humanity, those are issues that every society on this planet has to think very consciously about. So, in one hand, that makes me very optimistic, right? Because it takes us all back to a common space of understanding that this is something that we, as different religions, different political structures, all of us though can resonate around that. And I actually do think then the other thing becomes it's about courage and confidence, right? So what is our ability as leaders and as individuals in society to actually challenge some very basic assumptions? And I think what you're finding is that in many cases, the assumption of inclusiveness is not the foundational assumption. It's actually a narrative around disadvantage of some sort. And really challenging that and really making the assumption of inclusiveness and actually, humanity, a common component that's a big thing. So I am optimistic by nature, but I think there's a certain recognition that exists right now in our conversations that hasn't happened for a while, and I think we should take advantage of it. And I certainly think that the universities as institutions must play an active role in that. I think it's part of our duty. I think it's the thing that society's invested in us to do over the years.
And because some of this is so systemic and rooted in a lot of history and tradition, it's going to take a monumental effort. And it's going to take all the universities and the private sectors stepping up. And this force for change to make it happen. And you're right. I mean, the fact that there you were in Wellington, engaged in a Black Lives Matter protest or demonstration of support, gave a lot of faith to Americans who were struggling with this crisis on a more intimate level.
Yeah, I just think we need to appreciate that so any challenge of consequence requires high levels of effort, and it ultimately isn't about effort, it's about motivation, right? And so what is the motivation? What's the upside? And so I think what we've seen is the consequences of not doing it. right?
Yeah.
So the idea that somehow the status quo is an acceptable one, I think people need to just get that out of their mind. Like, this is not going to be a steady state that's going to allow us as a society to progress, any aspect of our society to progress. And so we've seen the consequences of this, but we also, I think, have begun to peer into some of the potential upsides. And that gap between where we are and what's possible, well, this is the leadership moment. This is the leadership opportunity. This is the educational opportunity. And it's not just going to be, leadership as in a big L. It's actually going to be leadership in a small L in terms of how individuals think through what they're trying to accomplish in their life, in their organization, how that has to be considered with a broader group, because it's otherwise going to be very limited. You can do a little with a small number, or you can do a lot with a large number. And that's a choice that every leader has to make.
Meantime, this is a major challenge and initiative that has collided with another, the remarkable disruption of all of our lives due to the pandemic. What impact has the pandemic, do you think, had on higher education? Plus and minus.
Much of my work focuses on disruptions. And so if you had gone back 2 years ago, I'd have talked to you about the work I was doing with different companies around technological disruptions. And of course, now we have a health disruption, if you like, a virus. But I think there's a similarity, right? So inherent, what a disruption does is it challenges the fundamental assumptions that underlie a business model, and it can make them either more relevant or less relevant. And I think that's what you're seeing right now in higher education. So we've had this disruption, this pandemic, and it has basically forced us to think about some assumptions. And some of these assumptions have proven to be no longer true. So for example, embedded in every higher education institution, largely speaking, is an inherent assumption that education is a place-based service. That to receive an education, you go to a place to get the service. And that's true whether we're talking about K through 12. And if you think about it, it's so deeply embedded as an assumption, it's actually embedded in our names. So we're not the University of California, we're the University of California, Irvine. We use 2 locations to denote that this is the place you come to get the service. And of course, that assumption has been proven not to be true, right? The pandemic has forced us to appreciate that education can be a place-based service or not. And that'll be a very interesting thing. So what does it now mean for us to be as an education institution when we can deliver in manners that aren't necessarily associated with physical space and in huge scale? That's a big one. I think another big assumption has been challenged is that we had a homogeneity of preferences in our cohorts of students and staff. So we would bring them together in a particular place as a cohort. We would give them a fixed routine as to what we were going to provide them in terms of a service, and they would do it. And now, of course, what we realize is now the virtual technology has allowed us to see that people want to learn early or late in the day. They want to learn face-to-face. They want to learn virtually. They want to engage with people down the street. They want to engage with people on the other side of the planet. And we can do all those things. And so again, as an education institution, we'll have to come back and sort of say, well, how can we meet this broad diversity of needs through the various different platforms that we have? Now, I should say, this pandemic has also reaffirmed some assumptions. Right. So one of the assumptions that we had was that one of the differentiations between sort of you just reading something online and you going to university was it developed a sense of community. Right. And interesting enough, we've seen that the role of a university in creating a sense of community of education or scholarship is actually really important. And that's something people still want. Another really clear assumption is reaffirmed is that ultimately universities create a lot of value because of thought leadership and the importance of research to guide insight. And I actually think maybe the most important assumption is reaffirmed is that the universities are important institutions in communities. So I look at what UCI has done in its role in supporting treatment for COVID and the delivery of vaccines, and the role that the universities broadly have played in terms of supporting families and students, in many cases, the only functional institution in a town. And so it's reaffirmed some things that we knew about ourselves, but it's also challenged some things that we hadn't thought about. And so we're going to have to be a lot more diverse in the way we think about how we educate people. And that'll bring a challenge, but it also means we have the opportunity to educate more people, which is great.
A lot of entrepreneurship and innovation occurs because it has to. Because there's a crisis of some kind, and smart people take advantage of the crisis to mobilize people and resources to make something new happen. And I think in general, there are a lot of people who believe that in higher education, the pandemic has accelerated the innovation curve by 3 to 5 years.
Mm.
So things that might have happened naturally over that time frame have now happened in a collapsed way. Do you share that belief, and what do you think are the benefits of it?
I definitely share that belief. I actually think it is forced along some patterns that we were already seeing.
Mm,
It's legitimized some activities that we previously were doing, but were seen as, if you like, peripheral, and now they've made it mainstream. I think it's given a lot of individuals and a lot of institutions confidence that they can broaden out their repertoire in terms of how they do things. But I also think it's going to be quite scary for a lot of institutions, and I think we can't understate that because we are entering into a new domain. But it is the world we're going to live in. So people talk about post-COVID and what will that world look like, but the diversity of needs that we've discovered, the preferences, the ways in which we can deliver a really world-class education, we're not going to forget that. And so it's going to be exciting for me and my role and for our institution as in the Merage School to hopefully provide leadership in that space and experiment in that space. And we'll get some of it right and we'll get some of it wrong. And that's just part of the innovation process.
I think the other exciting part of this is that there's so many startups now who are working on tools to
Mm,
enhance the learning experience online. And we know for sure that things like Zoom and other tools, Blackboard, whatever, there are a lot of collaboration tools that allow people to work in teams and work together effectively online, are relatively recent developments. So you have to wonder, my goodness, 5 years from now, where will we be with the technology itself to even further enhance the ability to deliver learning in a long distance modality, right?
Yeah, I look at my, you can look to the generation that's coming behind you as the, if you like, the canary in the mine. And what was fascinating for me was watching my children. I have three children. As when New Zealand went into lockdown and they had to immediately transition within like 48 hours to online education. And my wife and I were really curious as to how they would respond, but it was not that difficult for them. And because they had already developed the notion that their life was both physical and virtual. And in fact,
Mm,
they weren't making that distinction. That was just their life. It was, why would they exclude one part of their life? And I think for myself, was sort of thinking about, oh, I need to develop a life that has a virtual component where they had grown up in an environment like that. And so the expectation around that is set.
yeah.
And so part of this is we don't need to convince that group of individuals that this is a legitimate way for us to engage. It's more around continually trying to find ways to better leverage this opportunity. And my children have grown up with a virtual relationship with their grandparents. They why wouldn't they not Zoom their grandmother? And so why would they not Zoom their professor?
Yep.
And that's a change in the way we think about things, but it changes our opportunities.
Yeah, and changes the demand, right?
Yeah.
Because digital natives who are fully accustomed to living and playing and learning in the arena are going to be far more likely to want to continue to do that, as opposed to maybe uh, our generation didn't even think about learning online. Um, and the only you'll remember probably, I mean, when VHS tapes were sent to people, okay, who wanted to do this. I mean, you got to laugh at it now in terms of how ineffective and rudimentary it was, and where it's come so quickly. When you look at Mirage's assets, both in terms of what you have structurally, the ability of your faculty to respond to this challenge, the portfolio of programs you currently have. Where would you assess Mirage is in this revolution that we're living through?
Well, I think there's some big advantages, and certainly one of the great assets of the Mirage School that attracted me to the school was an explicit focus on technology.
Right.
And so the tagline that we have, leadership for the digitally driven world, one of the things that I wanted to realize was, is that just a tagline or is that a lived experience for us as a faculty? And as it turns out, it really is a lived experience. I think there was great leadership prior to me, recognizing that digital technology and data are major drivers of both economic and social activities in the communities we live in today. And in fact, we can't even think about those communities without those two components. And as a result, if we're going to be a business school that's focused on leading people in the future, that needed to be a part of who we were. And so many things were put in place. We had a digital learning team that we created years ago before the pandemic. It allowed us to transition, I think, quite seamlessly into online offerings and really have a more sophisticated perspective about blended delivery. The creation of a Center for Digital Transformation, which we've had for years to sort of help organizations think about how they begin to think through the way in which they deliver products or create products, or actually that perhaps the product is a digital solution. So this, I think, gave us a leg up in terms of our ability to kind of move through this. But I think it also, I'm really appreciative of the fact that every advantage, if it's an actual advantage, will be copied quite quickly. And so you continually need to evolve. And I think, now what we're seeing for us is, I think there's an opportunity for us to evolve our thinking as to what does it mean to be a leader in the digital driven world next? What is the next components around that? And I'm very excited about what those challenges will look like.
And I remember having the privilege of visiting the campus in those days, a couple of years ago, in fact, and really being impressed with, the thinking around what does it mean to be digital, and how is it transforming our business and our personal lives. And you're right. I mean, it's always having to look forward and how this is going to change. And certainly with machine learning, artificial intelligence, just a general increase in technology, its capabilities, its the diminishing cost of technology as well that makes it more accessible. All these things colliding together make for a very dynamic and exciting future, and one that obviously your role will be to prepare people for. When you think about that, there's the dangers of innovation as well. So you're also dealing with the perishability of innovation and how fast it is and how quick and how you have to stay ahead of it. And then the general public is dealing with the disruption that innovation causes. How do you reconcile those two things? Because on one level, you have to prepare students for careers in which they will not be replaced by robots or algorithms, while still being, adopting the leading technologies that allow you to do different things.
Well, it's important to appreciate that the technology is a tool. And, like every tool, it takes on the characteristics of the craftsperson that uses it. Yeah. And so, it will bring with it all the, the characteristics, both positive and negative, of the community that's utilizing. And I think this is if I think about leadership for the digitally driven world, the next iteration of that, it's going to be around understanding that we have now created technologies, we have access to data that will stretch what is possible for leaders, but they have to have a framework, both ethically as well as commercially, as well as sort of morally, to manage that. And otherwise, what will happen is it will just exacerbate all the inequalities and divisions that previously existed, and we will perhaps not realize some of the benefits. And I think you can look at the common discussion around digital divide that we see right now in society is a good example of that. Mm-hmm. So without any question, the utilization of technologies, digital technologies, and our ability now to capture and gain insights from data has enhanced many aspects of our life. For certain, we can see that. But by the same token, we also know that there are huge areas in our communities which have seen no benefit at all. And it kind of actually is surprising, because you would go, we now have technologies that should be able to address this. But we still see prevalence of market failures in many different examples. So, there was a recent piece of work that was done that found about 700,000 households, if you look at Southern California, sort of Los Angeles, Orange County, Riverside, San Bernardino, continue to not have any type of permanent internet access. And you kind of go, that's kind of amazing to think of. I just talked about us as being Silicon Beach, yet we have, a 250,000 households which would not have consistent, reliable access to what we would think in many communities is a very basic form of utility, if you like. We know that there's good examples where the industry success that we've seen in the digital space has not been beneficial to all communities. So, I note some research that recently was done by one of our professors, Sharon Cotman, which found differences in the hiring, promotion in people of color and women in the IT tech sectors. So we know that that workforce hasn't evolved in the way we would naturally think it would, despite some of the performances we've seen in by women and people of color in higher education. And we also know that, if you look at the companies that are actually driving this, that there's a very low representation of these companies from different communities. And it was a really fascinating piece of work that was looking at like 0.6% of all VC funding has gone to Black founded companies in technology, right? And something like 1.2% of VC funding in California has gone to Latinx founded companies. And you think about the Latinx community in California is 39% of the population. And so there's huge spaces here where the tool could be better utilized. And we should be encouraged, right? Because there are also great examples where the tool has created benefits for communities. So there was some recent work by one of our professors, Vibs Abhishek, which looked at how mobile banking actually enhances financial inclusion, particularly for lower income populations. So you're seeing a solving of a market failure problem. And some work led by Professor Nguyen, which found that shared platforms can actually enhance financial capabilities in certain communities because it allows people to have more income generation opportunities. So I think of technology as neutral.
Yeah.
Right? It has great potential, but its potential, like every other tool, is only realized based on the skill of the craftsperson. And I think our job in terms of preparing leaders is to enhance that skill, but making sure that we're doing it where these people are prepared holistically. So yes, they need to understand the technology. Yes, they need to understand the commercial model, but they have to understand the social implications of this. They have to appreciate the government regulatory framework that drives that. And if we can develop holistic leaders, this, I think, is that next iteration of leadership.
You make a really good point. And the truth is, probably 10 years ago, I think that the general public's view of technology and how it touched oneself was incredibly positive. And we've come to a point where now we realize that the rise of social media has caused political divisions that are unbelievable, where people are in their own echo chambers so that their views are reinforced, that people don't believe in facts, even though facts are more readily available to people than ever before. There's bullying online, there are violations of privacy. There is monopolistic practices by some of the leading companies in this business. So we've come with a very different view from 10 years ago, saying, oh, how wonderful it was to have your whole music collection in your palm of your hand, and being able to talk to your grandparents from a different country and maybe even see them. And now we're so polarized and divided, and we can't seem to talk to each other. And part of this is this disruption caused by the social media and putting us all in these little corridors of reinforcing views, whether they have legitimacy or not. It's quite a social dilemma.
Yeah, I would say that my experiences working with Indigenous communities in Australia and New Zealand reminded me of something. So I don't think it necessarily taught me this, but it reminded me of something that oftentimes we gloss over when we think about business schools. And one of the things that's a foundational premise in many of those communities is a recognition that economic activity is simply a manifestation of culture. Right. And in fact, when we engage in economic activity, all we're really doing is engaging in activity which is designed explicitly to reinforce, support, and ensure the survival of culture. And I say that because why that's important is then it becomes a matter of saying the choices we make about how we engage in economic activity are actually driven primarily by our values that we have within our cultural system, not necessarily what is necessarily pragmatic from an economic exchange perspective. So there are products and services that we can provide, but we decide not to provide because it doesn't make sense with our culture. There's ways in which we can engage in economic trade, which we do or don't do because it's consistent with our culture. And so when we have increased or changed the parameters of how we can engage. And now what we can do is we can engage digitally, we can engage with intangible assets, we can engage around data. Those are just other mechanisms by which we engage economically today. It opens up a question for us to say, how do we fit that in our culture? How do we fit that into our value system? How do we fit that into that thing that we see as being legitimate, appropriate, and right? And so it becomes an open question simply because we haven't had to think about it before. And so I don't feel discouraged by that, but I do think it reminds me that as a business school, that has to be a very prominent part of our conversation. It's not just about how we go about doing it. It's also reminding ourselves that the parameters have always been why we went about doing it. And if we divorce those two, then we never answer that question. And this is where we can kind of reinforce or make worse some of the challenges that we already had. And I think that's interesting. You know, it's not always the case that we see that as being a responsibility of a business school education, but I actually think if you go back in history and you look at major technological breakthroughs, that always had to be part of the conversation for us to do it in a manner that was sustainable. And, you know, and that's just going to be part of our challenge, but I think it's an important one.
Right. So, Ian, when you think about your school's tagline, what organizations or individuals come to mind who you think are leading exceptionally well through this digital disruption?
Well, I try to look at a wide variety of examples as I don't just think all of our learnings can come from business per se. I think we can learn things from business, but I think we can learn from organizations. And given what I just described around how we have to have a holistic perspective about what we think about in terms of digital technology and digital leadership, I would look at a wide variety of settings. So, you know, I would look at the not-for-profit setting, and I might look at an organization like Base 11, which is a national organization in the United States focusing on increasing STEM degree pathways and jobs and entrepreneurship in that particular space for a wide variety of communities. And I think they're doing some really interesting and exciting ways to sort of excite underrepresented populations to move into that space, and doing that in partnership with universities and doing that in partnership with industry and being a platform around it. So I look at that and I go, there are things we can learn as the Merage School of Business that we can influence that. I'm fascinated in how companies respond to disruption. And so I look at Microsoft as a good example. So here's a company that was a disruptor, right? They fundamentally changed the way we thought about things, were extraordinarily successful, only to be disrupted themselves.
Sure.
Where, you know, there was questions about their relevance, then to sort of reevaluate and then become a disruptor again. Right. And I think that that journey of sustainability is one which is very, very exciting to see how organizations can reinvent themselves and the type of leadership that is required to do that. And then if I look at the educational setting, you know, over the last year or so, I've been really intrigued with the organization called the African Leadership University. So this is a university that's been created with the goal of creating a Pan-African education, drawing from all the countries in Africa and utilizing digital technology as a way to do this. But they have an explicit goal of creating 3 million ethical and entrepreneurial leaders in Africa by 2035. And I go, what an interesting mission statement for an organization. And I think what you look in particularly developing economy settings is how they are able to leapfrog certain settings. Right. And I think we saw that in the last 10 years when we look at Southeast Asia, when many of those economies sort of were built for today. So they leapfrogged other economies. And so they actually, in developing settings, it gives you a very clear, objective insight into these are the possibilities we have. Where they're not trapped by some of our legacy investments. And so these are three examples of, you know, just three different types of organizations where I would look to say, well, one, thinking about how we engage with community, one, thinking about how we interface technology with education, one sort of looking at how we recreate ourselves over time. And I think those are just important lessons that we would apply in the Merage School. And it becomes part of our DNA, hopefully, about how we continually provide that ongoing leadership, but it's a continual renewal process for us.
Right. Fascinating. Yeah, I think some of the most intriguing lessons come from unusual places today.
Yeah.
And you can share these best practices across different organizations, companies, uh, uh, geographies, disciplines to great effect. So, in terms of looking at the portfolio of programs you currently have, how do you think this digital revolution is going to change them? Are we going to see UC Irvine offer an online MBA degree? Right now, there's one UC school that has an online MBA. And of course, a lot of schools are rolling out specialty master's degrees for long distance learning. Do you suspect that those options might be in your future?
Well, it's interesting because right now we actually offer an online MBA degree by necessity, so we
No,
didn't plan
yeah,
it that
exactly.
way. Yeah. And so it's interesting. We said, look, and we go, well, wait, we didn't set out to do this, but we're
That's
doing
true.
this. And, it was very fascinating to see the journey around that because it wasn't part of our nomenclature, it wasn't part of our logic. And so we had to come up with a way of thinking, well, what is this thing? So I think the world we're going to move into is a world of and. It won't be a world of or. We were already engaging in experiments with our fully employed MBA program where over time, as we talked to our students, we began to see that they wanted to have community in a sense of a face-to-face interaction, but these are busy people who
Yeah,
had major opportunity costs. And so we were beginning to offer that in a hybrid manner where not all of our instruction was face-to-face. Some of it was actually designed to be online, and we were finding ways to weave these two worlds together. Again, it was not or, it was and so now we've
right.
moved into this space where we've done some really creative things. We were one of the first, I think the first UC school to provide an online undergraduate degree in business. We ran and started this pilot. It just so happened that we had planned on starting it in fall of last year, and thank goodness we had that ready to go. And so, I'm confident that that will continue. And what's interesting about that experiment, if you like, is that we initially thought it'd be a cohort of students who would not want to come to campus, right? And they would take it. But of course, as we rolled out the courses, we opened it up to anyone, and we found people living on campus were excited to take those classes as well,
Right.
right? And so
Wow.
again, it's as we've unraveled this experience, what we've noticed is that we had a whole range of preferences and desires among our students. And as we've given them choice, what we've realized is that the same student that wants the in-person experience also wants the online experience.
Uh-huh.
And so I think for us, in terms of our programming, it's going to be developing, programming that provides that type of flexibility, optimizing our business processes, optimizing our educational experiences around both physical and virtual educational experiences, and really thinking of ourselves as a platform for education, more so than a place for education, and that platform incorporates multiple ways in which we can actually engage with people face to face. There's always going to be a place for that, virtually, both. And what I hope it will do is also open up opportunities for us to have a broader audience.
Yes.
Right? Because fundamentally, one of the passions that I have is how do we increase access to a world-class education? And there's a limit to how many people we can have in a particular space at a particular time. The technology helps us overcome that. I think the trend we're seeing around specialty master's degrees will continue. Certainly, it's been a very successful initiative for us. Our Masters of Business Analytics, our Masters of Finance, our Masters in Accounting have been very successful. We know from industry that that type of technical capability is very exciting. I would see us continuing to involve and have innovation around that. And maybe partnering more with other disciplines to create some integrative or interesting specialty areas so we can provide that technical expertise that industry really needs. But I think fundamentally it's going to be appreciating the variation in preferences. Of course, the other thing that excites me is that throughout all of this, the whole process that we've gone through for the last 12 months, the one consistent factor has been never have people been more excited to get educated. So the demand for education has never been higher. And maybe it's just there's only so many Netflix shows you can watch. At some point in time, you got to learn something. I don't know, but if you're an educator, that's exciting. It should give
Sure.
you just tremendous. It just becomes a matter of saying, well, to realize that if that means I have to do something slightly different in terms of how I deliver, okay, well that's the challenge. But wow, look at the reward if we're able to do it.
Binging on education has more benefits than binging on Breaking Bad.
I hope so. I hope so. It probably depends on the quality of the education, but I hope we can meet the mark.
Now, let me ask you about the undergraduate online experience, because that is a really pioneering thing. And you're bringing a great brand, the UC system brand, Irvine and Merage, to that equation. Did you find that you're able to draw from a geographic area that vastly expanded your reach in the early cohort, or is it still too early to really see?
I think it's too early to really see, but I would say that one of the goals that we had initially was not necessarily focusing on geographic reach. I think that may be one of the outcomes.
Yeah.
But I think it's also appreciating, it allowed us to tap into many communities that were simply not being served by us. And so we know there's huge differences in sort of college participation rates across different ethnic groups. And in particular, one of the big emphasis we would have is how we can increase the number of representation with, First Nations communities, Latinx, African American communities. And so one of the thoughts we had was this might be a way in which we can help bridge that barrier. And there's some initial indications to suggest that that might be promising. But one of the things that we've picked up on is that the opportunity cost for education is different across different communities. And when the technology, because it allows more flexibility, because it allows people to be able to get access to it while still managing other aspects of their life, actually reduces the opportunity cost. And so I actually feel like that's one of the promising things we'll discover in this pilot that we'll want to incorporate in. But also perhaps it does expand our geographic reach as well. That might be another outcome.
Right. Because the benefit is obviously that expanding reach, touching more people in more different corners of the world and in the United States itself, and more communities. It's almost a digital inclusiveness model, right?
Yes.
And then the scary part is the natural boundaries that kind of protected universities in their given locales or regions or states or nationalities are disappearing. And so now the competition is essentially global because you can take an online degree anywhere almost. So now brand and quality matter more than ever. You're sitting really pretty in the UC system with a great brand that I would think people from lots of different parts of the world would love to have on their resume as a credential. There are other schools that are going to be much more threatened in higher education by this trend. Do you think we're going to see a major consolidation of the higher education business over the next 10 years because of this phenomenon?
Well, I think you're definitely going to see the things we see in other market domains. I think you will see, and we already are seeing some universities that are closing, right, for a wide variety of reasons. And you're also seeing at the same time new entrants.
Right.
So we should appreciate that we cannot in any way, shape, or form believe that we have saturated the market with education. There are huge segments of the world which have not received access to higher education. So, the notion that we no longer have a market of individuals to serve is definitely not the case, right? So there is great potential for us to do more service. The issue is going to be the way we go about doing that. And what is our innovation in that? And the other component will be at an individual school level, what is your distinctiveness? So, you don't need to necessarily be all things to all people to be a very successful educational institution. But I do believe in this domain that we have, you should be very comfortable in your area of distinctiveness. And, this is why the caliber of our researchers, the faculty that we have, the professional staff that we bring, I believe that at the end of the day, it always boils down to, are you able to generate a conversation for students that is distinct and different and difficult for them to replicate on their own?
Yeah.
And part of that is the expertise you bring to that conversation. And part of that is also the people you bring to that conversation. And so thinking of us as a platform for us to do that is really, really critical. And so that means for, like every organization, making strategic decisions around, well, where will be the areas of investment that we will put into distinctiveness aspects? And for us, it's going to be this area of the intersection between sort of digital technology and business and data.
Right.
And all its various applications, whether that be in health, whether it be in education, whether it be in consumer products. That's the space that we're going to have. And by definition, it means there are other spaces we will probably let other universities focus on. And I think that's just what you're going to see as an industry, if it follows patterns that we've seen in other industries that have gone through this digital transformation period.
One of the confounding aspects of the rise of online education, to me at least, and you addressed this a little bit earlier, is this notion that one thing that technology does is expand accessibility, not merely because of reach, but also it should be because of price. Because you don't have a limit on class size, and therefore you could probably bring the prices down by reaching more people. And yet some of the early models at some of the better schools have maintained this position that in fact we should charge the same for an online degree as we would for a on-campus degree. And so you have some people who are real pioneers. Georgia Institute of Technology with their computer science degree was a big shocker and a disruptive player in that space. And there's some universities that are offering online MBAs for under $25,000 right now, that with good brands. So they're also playing in this disruptive space. How do you make sense of the pricing on the online degrees, and do you see it going to a more disruptive price where education is more accessible to all people regardless of their means and can reach the bottom of the pyramid, or do you see it playing out more at the high end and trying to deliver the highest possible quality and with little worry about price? Where do you come out on that?
Yeah, I kind of feel like we're going to see a little bit of both, to be
Yeah.
quite frank. And
Yes.
I think as you're going through this process, what you're seeing is in some of the statements that I've seen in other educational institutions, and I think rightly so, is saying, well, listen, because it's online doesn't necessarily mean it's cheaper to deliver per
Right.
se.
That's
Right.
right.
I mean, and so part of that is there is the transition costs that all the institutions will have to deal with, which actually does not mean that there's any cost benefit or cost savings associated with that. But then there's also going to be, I think more fundamentally, once you kind of get greater capability and expertise across the industry on this, an appreciation around ultimately the cost is about value creation and service.
Mhm.
And so you will naturally see different institutions have different perspectives around this is what it means to engage with us. And this is the type of service and type of capability we're going to provide you. And you will then naturally also see students make choices around that. And, and that can show up in some really interesting ways. So right now, the way we think about cost is we have a degree, which has a price for the whole degree.
Mhm.
One of the things that we're seeing already is the disaggregation of education.
Right.
And so it may actually be that the same number of classes might cost the same amount of money, but because of the way in which we can do credentialing today in a manner that we couldn't do before, you may have individuals say, well, I'm only going to take 4 of those courses because that's what I need for my particular desire or career path, as opposed to 20. And so you will, and we can probably do this in a way that we couldn't have done before. And so I think that will produce some interesting perspectives on price, because in essence, what you're saying to individuals is that they begin to have a lot more choice in selecting the level of service they want, the amount of education they desire. We don't ask a freshman coming into undergraduate today, would you like 1, 2, 3, or 4 years of undergraduate experience?
Yes.
We say, if you want to get admitted, you get 4, right? And it would not be shocking to me as we experiment with this, as we keep in mind it's both what we deliver, but also how society receives it. As we as a community experiment with this, that we will see different approaches to this. And I'm not necessarily don't think that's bad or good. I actually think that's an interesting thing. And I think we also play a role in sort of credentialing or certifying in society, which is quite important. And as a result, it will force us to ask questions about, reaffirm, and explain the credentialing and certifications we provide, which is not new. We've done that before. We've entered, it wasn't the case that we always had MBAs. It wasn't the case that we always had, we've had to explain to the market and the value of doing that. And so we'll go through that journey. And so again, it will cause us to question some assumptions that we had. Some of them will be true. Some of them will no longer be true.
True. Last question for you today, because I know we're running out of time. What do the business leaders of tomorrow really need to be prepared for when you think about this data-driven digital world?
I would say that any individual that has a desire to lead any organization of complexity in the future must appreciate that that organization will have a commercial role, a community role, and if you like, be a partner with government
Mm.
in some way, shape, or form. And so the leaders that we need to develop are the leaders who have the ability to conceptualize whatever they're doing, whether it be providing a particular service or a product, in that way. Because if they are unable to do that, they won't be sustainable financially. If
Yep.
they're unable to do that, they won't maintain a social license to operate, right? They may be legal, but they may not capture the value system of that community that they're serving, or they may come under scrutiny from government regulation. That means they do not have a license to operate. And I think each of these settings is something that we need to really instill as part of the perspective. And so that's my goal as an educator. I think that's the next iteration of business leadership. And I'm very excited about how the Merage School can contribute to that.
Well, listen, it's been a true pleasure to have the chance here to meet you and speak with you. I bet you're really excited to make the big move to California. When do you think you might be actually arriving and staying?
Yeah, well, I mean, things are trending positively right now around COVID, so I'm hopeful the next few months will bring an opportunity for us to make the move over safely. And certainly, I'm looking forward to getting to Southern California and experiencing all the exciting things that will bring.
Terrific. Well, real pleasure. Ian, good luck to you. And
thank you, John.
I hope to see you face to face when
I
you
will look forward to
here.
that. I will look forward to that.
I would love that as well. All right, everyone. We've been listening to Ian Williamson, the new dean of the Merage School of Business at UC Irvine. He took over on January 1st, virtually at least, given the pandemic. But he will be moving to Irvine very soon, hopefully vaccinated. I've been lucky to have my second vaccination a week ago Friday. So I feel already a little bit more confident about moving around with a mask, socially distanced, but a little more confidence.
We're getting there, John. It's positive steps. We're getting there.
Exactly. All right. That's a vision of leadership for a digitally driven world, the tagline of the UC Irvine Merage School. And now your job to carry it out and make it real and alive and expand it.
I'll look forward to catching up with you in a little time to sort of see how we're going.
Sounds good.
All right. All the best.
Take care.